My name is Thorne, and today we are going to use adjustment layers inside of Adobe Photoshop CC to post-process/edit this landscape photograph that I took at the ancient bristlecone pine forest about 3 hours north of Death Valley. So we're going to process it from this state here into this state here using nothing more than adjustment layers inside of Adobe Photoshop CC. There's a lot to cover today. I'm going to go from beginner to intermediate adjustment layers, how to use them if you know nothing about them. The first thing we want to do is analyze the image and ask, what do we need to post-process this image? Well, I think compared to where I actually post-process, I already kind of know in advance here. But let's say that this was our raw file, and most raw files are flat, and sometimes the exposure is off if you have a nice bright backlit sky. So the foreground is dark in comparison to the sky, and the colors aren't quite as good as I think they could be. And we definitely have some brightness issues we need to deal with here in the sky. Well, you know, we can correct a lot of these things inside of Adobe Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw, but the difference between Photoshop versus Adobe Camera Raw / Lightroom is that we have all the selection tools and we can be much more precise with what we're adjusting. So Photoshop's answer to adjusting all these tonal variances and color variances is called adjustment layers. So let's go ahead and jump right in and let's go ahead and edit this photo here today using nothing more than Photoshop adjustment layers. So to begin with, what I want you to do is make sure your layers panel is open and you're actually selected on the layers panel. If you do not have it open, go ahead and come here to the word window at the top of your menu screen, click on the word layers, and it will pop up, okay? I'm gonna go ahead and group it here with these 3 panels here because these are the ones I typically use in my post-processing. So let's go ahead and click on the word layers here. To access your adjustment layers, make sure you are on the layers panel. Drop down here at the very bottom, look for the icon that's a circle, a black, white circle, 50-50 here. Left click on that, and they pop down for you. Okay, we can left click and click any of these adjustment layers, and it will give us an ability to change things about this photo based on what that adjustment layer actually is intended to provide. So let's go ahead and discuss what these adjustment layers do, and then let's actually use them, and then let's see how we can use them in a more finessed, precise way. So to begin with here, this first set are fill layers. Okay, it's going to fill something with a color, a gradient, or a pattern. You typically would like to make a selection first, then fill that selection with one of these 3 things. That's going to be covered in the next lesson. Adjustment layers for graphic designers. This is adjustment layers for photographers and landscape photographers, portrait photographers, any type of photography. We'll be using the adjustment layers that dial in and are tuned to photography. Okay, not necessarily custom, not necessarily graphic design. That will be the next lesson. If you're a graphic design or you want to implement some text into your photo, check out the next lesson, which will be covering graphic design. I'm only going to focus on the adjustment layers that are used to edit / post-process our photography. So the next group down here, they're kind of grouped separate by these bars. We have brightness, contrast, levels, curves, exposure. These will all work with the tonality of your image or the luminosity of your image. They'll allow us to create contrast by amplifying the difference between light and dark values. They'll allow us to correct for an exposure, like in this case here, our sky is too bright, our foreground is too dark. We can separate those 2 into pieces and attack those in different ways. They allow us to work with the tonality. The next group down here, these are all going to work with color. They're going to allow us to either take color away, add color to something, or even change the color altogether from one color to another. We're going to cover those as well. Down here, this last group, these are more artistic-minded adjustment layers, and you can click on those and play with those. When we're down here, you'll know how to use adjustment layers. I'm not going to cover those in this lesson. Those will be covered in the graphic design lesson following this one. Only the lessons that are pertinent to photography will be covered in this lesson, so don't convolute this lesson with erroneous information that's not relative to landscape post-processing. So let's go ahead and start with the first group here. We have 2 adjustment layers we're going to ignore. We're going to ignore brightness, contrast. We're going to ignore exposure. We're going to focus only on levels and or curves. Now, why is that? Well, brightness, contrast, and exposure are really 2 old, antiquated adjustment layers that go way back decades with Photoshop. So if you have a Photoshop saved file that has these type of adjustment layers before these new ones were created, then it would make that file backwards compatible. But they are antiquated and they are not very useful in today's post-processing. They have been surpassed by levels and curves. So I'm not going to waste your time showing you adjustment layers which don't really work well. I'm going to show you something that works well. That's why you're here. Let's go ahead and start with levels here. Let me go ahead and click on the word levels. And what will happen we will get a brand new adjustment layer that will pop up above wherever we are on at the time when we make that selection. So make sure you're selected on the pixel layer and then make your adjustments so that all those adjustments stack above that. So in the layer stack, the layer order, when Photoshop's up here looking straight down our layer stack, it will take this effect and shine it down on the pixels beneath it. So if we were down here on this after and we made that adjustment layer, you'd never see it because this pixel layer here would block it from its view. So make sure you're on your topmost pixel information before you start creating adjustment layers. It's not all that necessary which order you make these adjustment layers. In photography, it's more important when we're doing graphic design work because we want to stack different shadows and patterns and the stacking order will matter. But as a general rule, in Photoshop here, the adjustment layer order doesn't matter too much. So when we make a new adjustment layer, we're faced with this new dialog that pops up here. And in this dialog, this particular dialog here for levels, we have an icon associated with that adjustment layer. You see it right here as well. And we have a graph inside here and some sliders. And almost every single adjustment layer will have a dialog with some sliders, and you tweak just like you were tweaking them in, say, Lightroom Classic, Lightroom Mobile, or even Adobe Camera Raw. But they differ here in Photoshop because we can use selection tools to fine tune them. And I'll give you an example right now. So in this adjustment layer here, we have the dialog. We have two ways you can be clicked on here. So if you're clicked on this right here, this mask, we want to ignore that for now. That's how we can work with a layer mask. And there's a layer mask tutorial link below. If you need how to use that, please check that out. If you're on this, just simply click on the icon right here. This is associated with that adjustment layer. They're all going to look different. They're all going to have different little icons that designate what adjustment layer type they are. Okay, so right here on levels, in this particular dialog, we're going to have a graph of our histogram, and this shows our dark pixels to our light pixels. Let me go ahead and just show you how we can use them. If I push in this dark slider, I'm going to move everything that's black to more black, and everything that's slightly black to pure black. The more I push it, the more I convert things to a pure black. All right, let me go ahead and move this back. On the right-hand side, I have my highlight slider. So the more I push to the right, the more I'm going to brighten everything. So every pixel that's from right here to right here has been turned pure white. And the more I push this, the more information I turn to pure white. All right. So as a general rule in landscaping, we're trying to expand our dynamic range. We want some nice blacks. We want some nice whites. We want every value in between. That doesn't mean you need to introduce pure black in every photo. And that doesn't mean you need to introduce pure white in every photo. If there's not specular highlights in your photo, you probably wouldn't want pure white in there anyway. You'd be losing detail. So in this particular image here, let's go ahead and push our blacks in. Let's go ahead and push our whites in. And this right here is our mid-tone slider, which means the pixel information that's not too black, not too white, kind of the gray tones in between if this was converted to a black and white image here. We can left click that and drag that back and forth as well. And they're kind of attached. So you see how this mid-tone slider moves when I move the black slider? If you need to move the blacks in, you can always compensate by pulling the mid-tone back. All right. Unfortunately, we're not really getting a good result with this because we're doing a global process. We're trying to process everything in the image. And that's not typically how you want to post-process. You want to select the areas that need a different treatment. So let me go ahead and close this dialog. And if I want to come back and change any other time, closing the dialog does nothing, that doesn't change my effect. I come back here and double click on this adjustment layer icon. This is the mask. Make sure you click on the icon, double click. It brings the dialog back up. And I can change this anytime. I can save this file and 10 years later, come back and change this, tweak this to a different lighter or darker value. Maybe my printer is printing too dark or too light. I come down here and lift those blacks up so that I kind of compensate for my printer. That's what these bottom sliders will be used for, is kind of compensating for your printer. All right. But up here, this is more like how you're going to adjust it for how you like it by your eye if your monitor is calibrated. So make sure your monitor is not too dark or too light, or you're going to work against yourself and your files won't look good online if you're sharing them on, say, something like Instagram. Regardless here, the problem we have with levels here is that we are adjusting everything in a global process. Let me go ahead and close this. This time, let me do it. I'm going to have a different approach here. Let me go ahead and turn the eyeball icon off. It's still there. We're just changing its visibility. This time, let me make a selection first. So let me use a new selection method here inside of Photoshop 2021, which is select sky. So if I come here to the word select, I drop down and say the word sky, you'll notice it's grayed out. It's grayed out because I'm located on a layer here selected with no visibility. It's always best to usually make your selections when you're on the topmost pixel information. So let me make sure I'm on my pixel information here first, make sure the eyeball icon is turned on. Come here to select sky, and Photoshop will select the sky. Now we're going to learn a little bit about adjustment, about layer masks here for a moment. So I make a selection first. Anytime I make a selection before I create an adjustment layer, that selection will be automatically transformed into a layer mask. And what a layer mask does is it blocks part of our image from the effect we're going to take place here. So this allows me to separate the foreground from the background and give a different treatment. So I'm not darkening down my foreground more by trying to darken down my sky. I can separate them into two pieces, if you will, and give them different treatments. I'm gonna go ahead and demonstrate right here. Let's go back to the adjustment layers here. Let's click levels. And this time, I want you to look right up here at the thumbnail that it created. I now have a black and white thumbnail, and what's white will be adjusted by the adjustment layer. What's black will be ignored. If I alt click on this, you can see the mask in real time. So what's black will be ignored, what's white will be changed. Let me go ahead and alt click back on my mask again, and you're gonna see what's gonna take place here. So when I make a selection first and then make an adjustment layer, I can cut pieces, I can mask pieces separately from the image as a whole and don't give it a global process. I only have to change what I want to change within my photo. So in this case here, I'm defaulted on this mask icon. So if you're seeing this and you're confused, let's go ahead and click right here on the left. This is the actual adjustment layer portion. The adjustable dialog portion of that adjustment layer, I should say. Let's go ahead and push our darks in some. Let's go ahead and push our whites in a little bit here, and then let's bounce around with our midtone until we find something we like better. So we like that. I'm going to go ahead and close this out. I'm going to go ahead and change my blend layer, my blend style here into luminosity. Now there's a lot of them here you can play with, but as a general rule, when you're affecting your tonality, anything adjusts lightness, darkness, exposure, or contrast, you want to set that layer blend mode to luminosity. The reason for that is that if you make an exposure change and you darken something down, you get saturation as a side effect. Now you may like that saturation effect, but we're going to have a saturation level adjustment layer here in a moment to work with the saturation separately so they don't kind of intermix. So you want to make sure your color information isn't changing your tonal information. You want to make sure your tonal adjustment layer changes don't affect your coloring, okay? We do that by simply changing the blend mode of anything that's in that levels or adjustment layer to luminosity blend mode. Anything in the color category, we're going to change that blend mode to color. All right. So let's go ahead and do that. So now we have the sky changed separately than the foreground, but the foreground's too dark. So let's go ahead and make another selection of the sky, but let's invert that selection. So we select everything but the sky, and then let's use another levels adjustment to adjust the foreground separate from the sky. So to do that, I'm going to make sure I'm on a pixel-based layer. It's just easier that way. Come down here to the word select sky. It's going to make the same selection we had before, but now I want to select everything but the sky. So it's easy for me to use Photoshop to select the sky, and then I can use the power of Photoshop to invert that selection, meaning I select everything else. So I select the sky first, come here to the word select in the menu system, drop down to inverse, and it will change the selection from the sky to everything but the sky. Now you can see my marching ant border around here. I'm selected in the foreground. Now I come down here to my adjustment layers and click on the word levels. And now what we see is we see an opposite mask than we had before. If I hold down the Alt key and view the mask, we can see what's white will be changed, what's black will not. So now I'm also defaulted here to the mask. Okay, I want to default here on my adjustment here. So now I'm on this adjustment. What I really want to do is brighten up this midtone. Well, this is my midtone slider here. So if I shift it to the left, I'm going to brighten it up. But now I kind of blow out those darks. So now the darks are kind of washed out. Well, I grab my black here, slider here, and push it in a little bit and compensate. And I keep playing with this until I find the right exposure that I think would be more correct. And you may disagree. That's fine. This is when you're post-processing your image, you pick what you yourself like. I'm going to leave it right about here. Now, I don't like the colors. The colors are off. Okay, but we're going to work with the colors in a moment here. But now, if I go ahead and control click, if I go ahead and shift click these and throw them in a folder and group them together in one folder here, I can turn this eyeball icon off and on, and we can see we've made some major improvement, if you will, to that particular, to this image when it comes to balancing the exposure levels. Now, it's a little overdone. So what I can do here is I can select this group, which will make changes to everything in that whole group right here. I can grab this opacity, and I can dial that back a little bit so it's not quite so overdone. All right, so what I like to do with my adjustment layers, I like to make I kind of like to overshoot them, and then I like to use my opacity to back it back off, so I can just keep bouncing around that till I see exactly what I want by eye. I like to overshoot, use my opacity, bring it down to taste. All right, so let's go ahead and drop down here again to another adjustment layers. Now we have curves. Curves works very similar to levels. I am going to leave a link in this description that shows you how to use levels and curves, how they differ. Curves are typically more powerful. I don't want to go into grave detail in this lesson about curves. I'll just give you a quick example. Let's click on the word curves. Make sure you're not on this mask portion of this dialog. Make sure you're on the adjustment portion. This is my black information. This is my white information. And I can change with putting points in this curve, different tonal values. So let's say that I want to darken just the darks. I can pull this portion down. And let's say I want to lighten the lights. I can push this portion up. And now I've introduced a ton of contrast by darkening the darks, lightening the lights, and we have what's considered an S curve. Traditional S curve introduces a lot of contrast in your photo, but we've also lost a lot of the highlight information, right? So I can grab this white slider here, pull this back down, okay? Or I could grab this white up here and move it as well if I could grab it. It's easier usually to grab this little slider down here and bring some information back that way. I can come out here, even in with my midtone here, I can control the exposure this way. And this actually looks pretty good, but it's a lot of contrast and it's really affected the color like I said it would. Let's go ahead and close the dialog. The change is still there. It's just the dialog. We can always bring it back by simply double clicking the icon and it brings it back up and we can change it as many times as we want. As we post-process, sometimes you're bouncing back and forth, changing one thing, coming back and rechanging something else, giving your eyes a break, come back and changing it again. That's the beauty of the adjustment layers. They are non-destructive. But now we're on this adjustment layer that's adjusting the contrast. So let's go ahead and change our blending mode from normal to luminosity, and we don't have those color shifts. Now we just work with luminosity. Now we don't have those blinding colors kind of affecting us. We can kind of see a little bit more. And honestly, I think that the foreground is still a little too dark. Well, I can come back in here to my group where I have adjusted, and if I'm not sure, I can turn this off and on to see which one it is where I've adjusted that foreground. Double click here, and now I can kind of brighten that foreground up a little bit more and bring it more into balance. All right. So now let's go ahead and work with a couple color adjustment layers. So if I drop down here from my layers panel to this half black, half white circle, I can come down here and now these are all going to adjust the colors. We have vibrance, hue, saturation, color balance, black and white. So what does vibrance do? Vibrance is like a saturation slider, but it focuses smartly on things that are more subdued. Your saturation is going to move everything up proportionally. It's going to increase every color at the same level of where it starts at its base saturation. But vibrance is going to use a little bit of AI to say what's more subdued. Let me focus on that. Let me give you an example. So I click vibrance, and again, we have our adjustment sliders. They look different for every adjustment layer. This one's working with color. So what I really want to do is come here to normal and drop this down to color. That way I'm not introducing tonal shifts when I make these color corrections. So vibrance will actually increase the saturation on the subdued colors more. It'll increase it on everything, but more so on the subdued colors. Let's look at the color in the sky here. It's kind of nice, but we're getting some really blue patches down here on the foreground. Okay, because it's really focusing on what's more subdued. The blue down here is much more subdued than the sky, so it's actually cranking that up higher. Now let me go ahead and move up the saturation. And now we see the sky is saturated, but the blue is to the lesser degree. Well, in this case, I really don't want to adjust the saturation on everything because it really makes this foreground really ugly in my opinion. That's why we use Photoshop to make selections first. So let's do the same thing we were doing before. Let me go ahead and turn off the visibility of this. This time, let's select the sky and give it a different treatment than we give the foreground. So first, make sure we're on a pixel-based layer here. All right, select sky. And let's adjust one with a hue saturation adjustment. Let's adjust another one with a vibrance. All right, so let's come down here and let's click on the word vibrance. And let's increase the vibrance now that we're just working with the sky. So we made that selection first. And what we're really getting, we're getting a little bit more blue being punched up here than the actual yellow and orange because it's less saturated. Now let's go ahead and supplement that with more saturation until I like the sky. If I think the blue is a little overdone, I can bring that vibrance back down because we know that vibrance is more focusing on that blue. Let me go ahead and close that out. And now we have this. If it's too much and we think it's overdone, come back down here at our opacity slider, drop that down a little bit more. Now let's come back down. I think I overshot here. My computer's running a little slow. So now let's focus on the saturation of the foreground. So I'm going to select on this pixel-based layer again. I'm going to say select sky, but I'm going to invert that selection. So I'm just focusing on the foreground in this case. So select sky first. And then we go to select inverse, which will select the inverse of the sky, which is the foreground. Now let's come down here and let's just pick hue saturation so I can show you what that does. So in hue saturation here, I can move the saturation as a whole, okay? or I can move just a particular color. So I can choose here from master to different colors and work with just the saturation levels of just those colors. Let's go ahead and first increase the saturation on everything. And then we'll notice that the blues are becoming extremely oversaturated. So I'm going to crank the saturation up here. Then I'm going to change this to the blue color channel information. All right. And then I'm going to pull the saturation down just on the blues. And let me go ahead and go to the cyans as well, maybe even the purples. I'm not quite sure exactly what that's being mapped to. And if I don't know for certain, instead of just bumping around here and guessing, I can grab this particular little icon right here, which is a scrubber. I can left click, well, when I have it in my hand here, I can left click on this color and hold down my shift key and pull it to the right. And it will move whatever colors it needs to, whatever sliders it needs to adjust those blues. Now let's say I want to increase this in the trees. I go ahead and with this scrubber still selected, left click this tree, move to the right, and I can increase saturation that way. There's a lot of overlapping colors in here, so it's really kind of hard. So I could use different selection tools. I could actually come down here and say, well, I don't really like all the blue. I could grab something like this polygon lasso tool, lasso around where the offending colors typically are residing. And then I want to feather that. So I go to select, modify, and let's feather this by about 50 pixels. So we have some feathering between those changes, so it's not really abrupt. Now that selection made first, let's come down here to hue saturation, and let's pull that saturation down. And that's desaturating everything to more of a flat gray here. Let's go ahead and crank it up a little bit more. That looks better. If I really want a different color altogether, I can click the word colorize right here, which will turn that whole thing into a specific color wash. I'm just going to go ahead and demonstrate. I probably won't stick with it. Let's click the word colorize here. And now it's going to color this area to whatever I have selected here in my hue adjustment. And I can keep moving until I find something that would be more like, say, a brown. Pull my saturation down even more. And then I work with my luminosity of those colors by lightening or darkening them right here. And let's say I like that, but I think it's overdone. Make the adjustment first. Be selected on this adjustment layer, and let's reduce that opacity so it's not quite as strong. And that brings our colors a little more in balance. The colors are still off, right? Like we have some brown shifting in here. We have all kinds of things going on here. Let's go ahead and turn off our color adjustments here just so we can start at a baseline so I can kind of show you the other tools without really muddying this thing up too much. So now that I'm on, it doesn't really matter too much where I'm at in the stack. You can kind of move these around. They don't always have an effect. They will if they're fill layers, if they're adjustment layers. Typically, it doesn't matter what order they're in. Let's come down here, make sure we're above our pixel layer. So this layer, the new layer, will pop up above the pixel layer, so it shines down on that pixel layer. So I could be on this, or I could be up here. And as long as I'm selected on this layer or above my pixel information that I want to affect. Come down here, and this time, let's pick the word color balance. All right, I'm going to color balance everything. All right, I'm not going to make a selection first, but you could. In this case, I want to kind of look at my colors and say, well, what's kind of off about my colors? Well, I don't always know. Sometimes I just want to play. I want more reds in here. So now I'm selected between, I can select between my highlights, midtones, and shadows. I like to start with my midtones because that's 80% of what it's going to affect. Then I can tint different colors in my shadows and highlights if I so desire after the fact. So make sure I'm selected here between shadows, midtones, or highlights, meaning which luminosity range of values we're working with here. I'm working with the more middle gray area if this was a black and white image. And let's shift some more red into the image. And that looks better. Let me go ahead and try the blue here. And it looks like the problem we're having here is that if I correct the sky, I get the color cast in the foreground. So now I have to go back here again. Let's go ahead and turn this off. Let's make sure I'm selecting on my pixel layer. Let's select the sky and let's do them separately. So select sky, make the selection first before you make the adjustment layer, and it will mask to just the portion that's selected and only affect that. So while I have the selection in place first, come down here to my adjustment layers, click color balance, and let's push some red into that sky. Let's push some yellow into that sky. Let's play with our magenta here. That's not so bad there. Let's go to our highlights here and let's push some yellows into those highlights. I'm kind of overdoing it here, a little overdone. Let me go ahead and close this dialog. It doesn't take away the change, it just closes the dialog. While I'm selected on this adjustment here, let's go ahead and drop down to the word color. So it's not giving us a shift in luminosity. And that looks much better, right? But it's a little overdone, so let's pull our opacity down and find something a little more tasteful. Now let's do the opposite and let's select the foreground and make a color adjustment to the foreground that's different from the sky. Because I can't introduce red into the sky without introducing red into my tree because they're in the same selection. So I make my selection first, and then I can just make my adjustment layer will only focus on what is selected. So select sky, and then we're going to do an inverse of that selection. So we can select the foreground, and we're going to do a color balance on that as well. So select inverse here. And now we're selected just on the foreground. Now when I click color balance, I can shift those colors more blue, more yellow, more green, more magenta, more red, more cyan. So right here, I think I have too much blue in here. See how I was getting all those blue patches? Let's put some yellow in there, which will neutralize some of those blues. And now it looks a little too green. So let's move this to the magenta slide to neutralize some of that green. And then let's just play with the middle here and see what we need to do. And that looks much more neutralized to me. Looks more of like a neutral color, still a little too dark. But I'm also on normal here. Let's move that to color. And that kind of affects our tonality a little bit better. So this is how we can correct the colors. Let's keep working down this here so I can show you more adjustment layers. Black and white is going to allow us to convert this to a black and white. But with these colors here, we can actually, well, we know there's a lot of red in here, right? I can actually, allows me to adjust the luminance of that red. So I can make a custom black and white much more striking by focusing on specific colors and changing their values. And then with the yellows here, we know there's a lot of yellow in here, but it's primarily in the brighter areas. So if I want more information in the sky, I can darken the luminance of the yellow channel. If it over darkens the red, I can bring the red back up and find something a little more harmonious. And then if I really think that that's too flat, which it actually is, I can come back down here, throw a curves on top of there, and put a really strong S curve on there to make a really strong high contrast. Let me Control Z here. If you have dots you don't like, left click, pop them off. Let me put one down here to darken the darks. Let me put one up here. My computer's just moving really too slow today. Darken the darks, lighten the lights, and I can make it extremely contrasty. Let me change from normal to luminosity, and then let me pull this opacity back down to something that I like more. All right, not saying I like this, just showing you how you can use these. Let me go ahead and turn off the curves. Let me go ahead and turn off the black and white. I want to show you what they can do. All right, let's go ahead and drop on down here, see what other adjustment layers we have to discuss. We have the photo filter. I'm going to go ahead and click this. Photo filter will put a color wash atop something with a blending mode already built into it. So in this case, we have defaulted here to a warming filter. You can drop down and choose different colors like sepia. All right. If you don't like the pre-made colors here, you can also double click on the color itself and choose your own color from the color picker, and it will put a color atop that. Now, the density works kind of like an opacity slider. So if we go ahead and crank that up, that effect becomes more apparent. Okay. Now, in this case, blue is opposite of orange. So blue is going to neutralize the orange. It's going to blue up the foreground, and it's going to take some of the orange out of the sky. We typically won't use that in this particular instance here. I just want to show you what they do. Let's go ahead and turn this off. Let's drop down here again. So now we're going to go ahead and click the color lookup table down here. What a color lookup is a set of mapping instructions set within a specific little file that will remap your contrast and color. So it might map a near black to a black. It might map a yellow to an orange. Different LUTs or color lookup tables have different effects. So to implement that, right here from this dialog, we drop down here where it says 3D LUT file, drop down and pick some of these pre-existing. If I pick something like bleach bypass, it has a really strong, overblown, washed out look. Let's go ahead and click it, and it will really throw a lot of high contrast on there. All right, so this is how we can post-process our image using adjustment layers. Now, obviously I didn't make a perfect adjustment here. I'm just showing you what they all do, and I'm kind of stacking them on top of one another. You adjust your own way. Lesson 2 coming up is graphic design with adjustment layers, how to put in patterns, fills, textures, add text. It's going to be pretty awesome. Check that out if you're in anything graphic design. The third follow-up to this little mini series here is how we can use adjustment layers in a very fine-tuned, more of an intermediate to advanced lesson. When you're ready for that, when you've watched the layer masking lesson that has a prerequisite, I'm going to show you how we can make our own custom layer masks, how we can use really detailed selections, how we can get very precise with our adjustments of our post-processing.